Types of neurons. There's 4 major types of neurons. There are others, but these make up the overwhelming majority of the neurons that we find in the body. Multipolar neurons, unipolar neurons, which we usually just call unipolar neurons, but really the proper name for them is pseudo-unipolar neurons. There are true unipolar neurons, but they're so rare that you don't really say them, mention them, and when you do, you mention that they are true unipolar neurons. Interneurons and bipolar neurons. Unless otherwise specified in these lectures, when we talk about neurons, we're going to be talking about multipolar neurons. These are the most abundant neurons overall in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, and a very large player in the peripheral nervous system as well. They also have a really characteristic one way in, one way out kind of an arrangement. There's a really discrete and obvious arrangement of parts, so it serves as a pretty good model too for how information runs through a neuron without a lot of unnecessary complication. In the case of a multipolar neuron, you have one axon to a cell body, tons and tons and tons of dendrites that branch tons and tons and tons of times. The receptive end is at the dendrite end. You have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of branching axon terminals, and this is the transmittive end. Most motor neurons have an interneuron type of a arrangement. A motor neuron will receive information from something and deliver information to something. Some multipolar neurons are motor neurons. Many of them are. There are some exceptions. Unless otherwise stated, for our purposes, assume that when we're talking about a neuron, it's a multipolar neuron, and assume that that multipolar neuron is probably a motor neuron. Bipolar neurons are really only found in the retina of the eye and in the olfactory bulb. That's where you pick up smells in the brain. These have 2 processes, a long dendrite that branches at its end and an axon that branches at its end. And the soma is in the middle, like this. And just to draw it bigger, you have a receptive end, which counts as a dendrite, a long process that all of that information comes through, a cell body that's in line with it, and then you have an output axon with its axon terminals. Most of these bipolar neurons do not generate action potentials. They only generate these smaller, buildable, transient signals called graded potentials. Again, they're fairly rare in the body because they only happen, or they only show up in 2 sensory areas. Pseudo-unipolar neurons feature one long process that meets the cell body in the middle by way of a little axon branch. So you have a receptive end that comes down and you have a myelinated process. It's not called an axon because this is a receiving end. Receptive dendrites, input up to the cell body, down and then out with a true axon and axon terminals. Information does not have to go through the cell body. The cell body has that little attachment so that it can send vesicles and stuff to the axon. But really, when you get an action potential through one of these guys, it's going to go straight through without going through the cell body at all. Both of those, the peripheral process that's attached to the receptive endings and the axon attached to the axon terminals, is continuous. These are mainly found in the peripheral nervous system at the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal cord. We'll talk about the spinal cord arrangement later, but know that dorsal means back. Ganglia is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So along the spine, at the back part, the part of the nerves that come out of the back part of the spine, the spinal cord, and there's cell bodies that are accumulated there. is where you're going to find these nerves. And those all have to do with sensory information, bringing in sensory information to the central nervous system. So just to reiterate, we have two major types of neuron classifications. We have afferent, sensory, and efferent, motor neurons. Remember, those are the divisions of the anatomical divisions of the nervous system, I should say. Basically, all sensory neurons are pseudo-unipolar. These may either directly pick up a stimulus or might communicate with a specialized cell that's for transmitting a stimulus to one of these neurons. And the receptive end has a special name called the receptive field. Remember, the ends of these branch. You have interneurons often inside of the central nervous system. We'll talk about that later. And then you have motor neurons that go out to something else. Here you can see your afferent pseudo-unipolar neuron and an efferent and sensory here, motor multipolar nerve. So the receptive end of a pseudo-unipolar sensory afferent nerve, you're going to have a lot of processes that cover an area. This whole area that the processes cover is referred to as your receptive field. That information is transmitted down an axon to the central nervous system. If you need to add neurotransmitters or something along the way, the cell body may inject them partway through. The output end, the axon terminal end of the pseudo-unipolar nerve, will interact often with an interneuron or directly with the dendrites of the cell body, the soma, of a multipolar neuron. That will send its impulse through a long axon to its axon terminals that will stimulate often a muscle. This is a unidirectional arrangement. Remember, the receptive field and the receptive end only brings information towards the axon. And when the axon gets stimulated to fire an action potential, that can only fire in one direction. So no matter where the stimulus happens, you're going to have sensory afferent pseudo-unipolar neurons input, motor multipolar efferent neurons serving as output.